Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a librarian at the Port Orange Regional Library, and I'm here at the Port Orange Depot in lovely Port Orange, Florida. I'll be speaking to Larry Powers all about our little depot. Larry, thanks so much for meeting me here today. Now tell me, you are one of the founding members of the Port Orange Railway Society. When did you form that society and why?
Well, first let me thank you for having me today. And we formed that society back in July of 2019. And the reason was we had this great old building and nothing was being done to it, and we wanted to preserve it.
Can you tell me about this old building?
Well, it goes back to 1894. All right. What happened? Well, to understand this old building, you got to understand what was here before. Originally, Port Orange, the building you see here is actually two buildings. It's our passenger station and our original freight station combined. And this building here, the freight house, this part of the building wasn't built here in Port Orange. It's built at another location. I don't know where, but it's built the same year. But you can tell it's different because of the difference in this is board and batten. The battens are slightly larger on this side than they are on the north end. And originally, what happened, it was, what happened was the Great Depression. Okay, so they had the two buildings together, but we went from 7 trains to 2 flag stop trains. And the way a flag stop worked is if you couldn't just stop any train, but you had trains on the actual schedule that you could stop. They wouldn't automatically stop, but if there was passengers to pick up, they would. Somebody would hold a flag. Now, as the train started moving faster, I'm told by Alan Green, former mayor of Port Orange, that they used to put blasting caps out ahead of the trains to let them know that there were passengers at the next depot, and it'd go bang, and they would hear it over everything going on with the locomotive, and they'd see somebody with the flag holding it up, and they would stop. So that's what happened, and that just tells you the effects of the Depression that it had on this area and areas throughout the country. You know, go from 7 passenger trains every day to 2 flag stop trains. And that's why I think that they built this, put these 2 buildings together, because they really didn't need the passenger depot anymore. They kind of just recycled it. And just keep in mind, originally the passenger depot was built at ground level, because when you're getting off a train, you want to go walk on the street and go to your transportation, whether it was a buggy or it was an automobile. And this had to be higher up because they wanted to unload freight right from the boxcar into the freight house. And so that's why this building was higher than the original passenger station. And behind you there was a exterior freight platform. They took that off in 1939, and I think the reason they took it off is they really didn't need it. They left it in this configuration because in 1939, after 9 years of the Depression, what they needed in Port Orange was a place to put freight and lock it indoors and out of the weather. And that's why they kept it. Before the depot, Port Orange was extremely small. Up in Daytona, there were fewer than 100 people, and I'm sure the population of Port Orange was much less than that. And what the railroad did is it created the first land and tourism boom on the East Coast, so that's why it was important. And this little depot here is a small part that we have here in Port Orange of Flagler's once great empire that he built in the first part of the 20th century.
Can you tell me about Flagler and the railroad system?
Well, ironically, he really didn't even want to build a railroad. You know, he was an older man by the time he came to Florida. He had made his money with Standard Oil and John Rockefeller, so he was rich already living up in New York. But the problem was his first wife became ill and they needed a warmer climate. So one of the places you could get to in Florida at that time, and we're talking about the late 1800s, was you could get into St. Augustine. And like many of us today, they just fell in love with that town. But he never liked the railways or the hotels that were there. So he said, you know, I can do better. I'm going to build my own or buy my own. And that's how he got in the business of railroads. He built up there in St. Augustine the Cordova and the Ponce de Leon. The Ponce de Leon, of course, is part of Flagler College today. And he needed a railroad to get the materials for those big hotels. And if you can imagine this, at the time the railroads were only, they had tracks, but the tracks were made of wood with metal covering them. And the cars were actually freight cars, passenger cars that were pulled by mules. I mean, they would, in the near future or shortly thereafter, they would add steam trains and add, you know, the steel rails. But initially, that's how it started out. So that's what he was dealing with. And so he bought his first railroad in about 1885, which was the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, and Halifax River Railroad. And from there, he built the Florida East Coast Railroad. Now, as I said, Port Orange was quite small, and the first train that came in this area, as far as Port Orange is concerned, was the St. John's and Halifax Railway, and they built a line from up near Palatka, a little town that no longer exists called Rollstown, down to Daytona, and that happened around 1886. And that was true of many of the early railroads. They connected towns on the East Coast to the St. Johns River, and they take a steamer up to Jacksonville, and that's where they caught their connections then. But that, as you can imagine, was a long trip, even with the railroads. Before that, you know, if you had to get out of Port Orange, you would either take a stagecoach on the Old Kings Highway, or you would go by boat. There used to be a dock right there by Aunt Catfish's in their north parking lot. There was the Port Orange House there. And you take a boat out through what is now Ponce Inlet, they called it Mosquito Inlet back then, up to either St. Augustine or Jacksonville. And the other way out was to take a buggy or horse over to Enterprise and catch a steam launch and go up to St. John's to Jacksonville that way. And you can imagine the time it took to do this kind of travel. And so we needed the railroads. But it turned out that when he originally built the railroad, he stopped at Daytona. And what happened there, he was pretty much happy. He had rail lines running out to Hastings and Palatka, so he could get the farm goods to feed his hotels. You know, he had enough infrastructure in place to support both the Orman here and the hotels up in St. Augustine. But that would change, and towards the end of the 19th century, there were 3 years of major freezes. And he said, I want warmer weather. So he started looking south, and that's how we acquired our station here in Port Orange, because he built the line all the way to Miami. And the reason he did that partially was because Julia Tuttle, who's the founder of Miami, and William Brickell offered him land down on the Miami River. In fact, at one time they were even going to call Miami Flagler, or name it after him, but he wouldn't have that. So he decided 6 years after the railroad came to Daytona, he decided to extend the line all the way down there. And in 1892, it arrived in Port Orange. Now, it would be another 2 years before they built this station here. And originally, they built a single building, which was a passenger station. And that station was down on Dunlawton. It was just south of Dunlawton and east of the tracks. And it consisted, like I say, a small rectangular building. It had a covered platform on the north end, and waiting rooms, and station agent's office, and baggage room, I believe it was in there. And the idea is get your passenger traffic built up. And the whole idea, like I say, the whole business model with the railroads was develop along the right-of-way, so you're developing your customers both for passengers, for tourism, and also for the products and the industries that were built along the railroad. And that's how they made their money. And he did it in a big way. The Florida East Coast Railroad had a real estate development company. They developed farms and industry. They developed steamers that went to Bahamas and to Cuba. And so it really was an empire that he created.
And it's really because of him and his empire that Port Orange is where it is today.
Well, yeah, Port Orange was here before, as you know, it was created by Mr. Hawks, or he's the one who named it anyhow, Port Orange. I heard it was going to be named Orange Port at one time, but they changed it. But yeah, the railroad just had a phenomenal impact on the entire East Coast. I would say Port Orange wouldn't be what it is today, and many cities on the East Coast wouldn't be what they are today if it wasn't for the railroad. I mean, south of what's today is known, Volusia County. If you went south of Volusia County in, say, 1880, you wouldn't see very much down there. There'd be a house here, farmstead there, maybe a trading post here, but there was nothing that you would call a town or a city or anything like that until you got probably to nearly Key West. So that's what the railroad did. And it would take you weeks to travel, say, to Jupiter, to where Miami is today. It was through swamp and harsh conditions. I've seen reports of the first surveyors who went down to lay out the line to Miami, and they came back, sick with malaria, their clothes in tatters, like they had been on an expedition to the Amazon or basin or something like that. It was that rough. And the people who lived here in Port Orange, the pioneers, they were rough. Back then they had two seasons. They had the mosquito season and the non-mosquito season. And most of the people who stayed here would stay in the winter when there weren't mosquitoes. So that's how it became important.
So this building in many ways represents not only Port Orange's history, but the history of Florida.
Yeah, definitely of the East Coast. But yeah, and not only Port Orange history, the history of America at that time is the railroads and the connecting of the country with the railroads after the Civil War that really built this country.
So you created a society to help save this building.
Yes.
Tell me about that process and what you're doing to help protect this building.
What we're hoping to do with this building, first of all, the building belongs to the city, so everything we're doing is through the city, but we're hoping to raise money. The first phase would be to repair and redo the outside. And what we want to do is put this building back to its 1939 configuration, which is what you see here today. And that's how the railroad left it. And that's how and we can't change it, because basically the reason it's on the National Registry is because it is important to show how the railroad changed this building with changing economic times. And originally, when this was built, there were no roads. There wasn't even a road between here and Daytona, not until 1904. And there wasn't the intercoastal waterway. That's why all these waterways, the rivers, all have different names, because they were separate waterways, like the Indian River and the Halifax. They were actually separate waterways. You couldn't just travel right down them. So the railroad was important, and this original depot was built in the horse and buggy times. So rail travel was also the fastest thing around at that time. And so most people who would have gone up at that time to, say, shop in Daytona or gone up to Daytona would have rode on the railroad. So that's why it was important. It was certainly faster than horse and buggy, and if you could ride all the way to Jacksonville, that's faster than going over to the St. John's and getting up to Jacksonville that way. So it really changed the nature of transportation here. By the way, it put Buck's Stagecoach out of business, but that's another story. A lot of people in Florida think of Florida just from the 1950s on, when the tourism business really took off. But there's a whole history before the war, and that people don't know about. I didn't even know about, to be honest with you. So we want to not only provide that to the public, but preserve it where we can too. And that's what this building does.
And you got a grant from Volusia Echo.
Yeah, that's how the city was able to buy that. City actually bought this before we even got involved. That was in 2015. And they had the, foresight to save it. In fact, the city saved it twice. I was saying how roads kind of pushed aside, roads and jet aircraft pushed aside the passenger traffic on the railroad. Well, Dunlawton literally caused this building to be in this location because they had to move it when they widened Dunlawton, so it was pushed aside for a road.
Now, this building is about over 125 years old. Mm-hmm. Why now do you want to try to preserve it?
Well, it's starting to degrade, as you can see, and it is old, and it does need to be restored. It's been listed by the Volusia County Historic Preservation Board as a historically endangered property. Its significance as a historic structure is possibly going to be erased by, the gradual deterioration of the building.
So it's an endangered historic property.
Yeah, with a bright future.
With a bright future.
Yeah.
Tell me more about your hopes and dreams for this. What do you want it to become?
Okay, well, I don't want it just to be a museum. I mean, that's part of it, but not everybody's in the history. We're hoping that rail fans will come, and as you just saw, see the trains go by. We may even have at some point rocking chairs here where they can sit and observe the trains. And we hope that this becomes part of a historic district here in Port Orange, tied into the sugar mill up that way and tied into the old church, the Episcopal Church, and there, even down the street on Nancy, that's right over here, there's an old, the Tedder House, who was one of the butchers here in town. So I think we can tie these together, and it's not just about saving the history, although that's the main motivation for me, but it also can mean money for the community and for businesses here, and we'd like to see that happen.
I would absolutely love to sit on this loading dock in a rocking chair and watch the trains go by, drink lemonade, and talk about the good old days.